Dude, that's a lot of talking. Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today's video is going to be a little different. A while ago I was at the Fredericksburg Area Woodworkers Guild, which they meet every Saturday. So if you're anywhere near Fredericksburg, Virginia, halfway between DC and Richmond, if you're within 2 to 3 hours, it's definitely worth the drive. It's a fantastic event, so definitely go take a look at that. I'll leave a link to them down below. But I was speaking there, and I actually got a chance to record what I said, and I've had a few people asking me to actually take a look at that. So it was kind of an interesting speech. This is a topic that I'm kind of mulling around in my brain. I've talked, I've used the speech a few other times for other places. But I want to kind of formulate this idea, and it's kind of the thesis of wood by Wright. So what am I doing here? What's the purpose of these hand tools, and how does this affect our regular daily time in the shop? So let me quit talking and start talking some more.
James Wright of Wood by Wright.
Thank you.
Thank you. Check out the shoes.
My shoes. I don't know why people like my shoes so much, but the best shop shoes you can never have are clogs. And if a chisel falls off the bench and jabs your toe, it's okay. It's just wood. Yeah, I'm James Wright. I always want to say welcome to my shop, but I'm not in my shop right now. Just so I know, how many people here have seen one of my videos? Oh, okay, so a decent amount. I am not a woodworker.
How many are subscribers to his page? That needs to change today.
Thanks. I am not a woodworker. I have people who tell me, are you a professional woodworker? I don't consider myself a professional woodworker. I am a hobbyist. For me, woodworking is it's something I can go in the shop and escape the world and the problems and my kids, and I can have a little bit of fun and relax. And I like to share that passion with people. So I am not a professional woodworker. I am a hobbyist. Now, what I currently do is I teach hand tool woodworking, and I've had several people who misunderstand what I'm doing with that, because a lot of people think that once you get into hand tool woodworking, then you're going for fine woodworking, or you're going for a historical woodworking and historical methods. And I don't do either of those. I do not do historical woodworking, and I do not do fine woodworking. I do hobby woodworking. And so that's kind of what I want to teach, because there are a bunch of people who you've worked with power tools in the past, but you now want to slow down. You want to enjoy the process, and that is what I'm doing. So I just wanted to dispel a few myths off the bat. I'm not a fine woodworker. I'm not a historical woodworker. I am a hobby fun woodworker. A little bit about my past. I grew up in a shop from the time I was 5 years old. As you said, I was raised power tools, and with my dad's shop, I never touched a hand tool. We had chisels in the shop, but the chisels were there so you could open paint cans. Who would ever use one of those on wood? I mean, it didn't make any sense to me until I moved and sold all my tools, and I became a stay-at-home dad. And I became a stay-at-home dad because my dream job, was only making enough that I could then pay the babysitter so I could go to my job. And so my wife makes more than I could dream of, so why am I working? I came home, I stayed with the kids, and that has been a huge passion for me, but if you're with kids 24/7, you need a hobby. And I had gotten rid of all my woodworking. Well, the house we were living in had a shop that was 8 foot had a space in the basement that was 8 foot by 10 foot. And I immediately thought, I'll get a table saw and a planer and a joiner, but 8 foot by 10 foot in a basement, it's not going to do anything. Until I came across a video on a YouTube channel called Worth the Effort. And he was making a grooving plane out of a block of wood, and doing it all with hand tools. And it was this light bulb moment of, wait a second, I can do woodworking. I can do it in a small shop. There's no noise, little dust. It's safe for the kids. So I can be in the shop with my kids with me and I can have them experiencing what I'm doing alongside of me. And it was just this epiphany moment, and I had a whole new enjoyment for woodworking. I grew up loving woodworking. It was a passion. It was a fun thing that I could do. And I had to get rid of that as we moved, and that was kind of like a heart-wrenching thing. But then to find hand tool woodworking, it was a whole new joy. And I got to learn everything about woodworking all over again. And that passion came back again. And that is what I'm trying to do with Wood by Wright, is share that joy, that passion for woodworking, and particularly doing it through hand tools. Because one of the things that I found is that the community at large is focused on the project. A lot of people get into woodworking because they want to build something that they saw at IKEA, but they don't want an IKEA thing, they want something they built. And the goal is building that side table. And we get so focused on the end that we're always looking for the fastest method, the most efficient method, and we're running through all the processes to get to that end. And I want to tell people, slow down and relax and enjoy every step of the way. So a lot of times when I pick a method, I'm going to pick a method that is stupid. I'm going to pick a method that is slow. I'm going to pick a method that is inefficient. I'm going to pick a method that intrigues me. And a lot of the historical methods and hand tools like that, they are things that slow you down, and they make you stop and think about it, and they're a skill to be learned. So today I actually want to cut a dovetail with hand tools and show you a dumb way of cutting a dovetail. I mean, I'm sure most people in here have seen how to cut a dovetail with hand tools. It's probably one of the first skills. But there are dumb ways to do it that can be enjoyable. Make sure I'm not... if anyone has any questions, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling. But if there's something particular you want to know or see, let me know. I would love to help you with that. Cool. So what is a dovetail? Historically, a dovetail is a trashy joint. It is the joint that everyone would try to hide because you've seen the half-blind and the full-blind dovetails, and you go into the Japanese world and they try and hide all the joints. A dovetail used to be kind of looked at the way we look at a pocket hole. You hide the pocket hole, you put it on the back of the piece, you put it where people can't see it, or you plug it, or you would veneer over it. And historically, that's the way a lot of people viewed a dovetail. It was an ugly thing. You would try and hide it, you put it on the back of the piece, you veneer over it, and you get rid of it. Whereas nowadays, people look at a dovetail as the pinnacle joint. This thing you hold in high regard, and it's the thing once you get into hand tools that everyone wants to cut a dovetail. And I kind of look at that and laugh because from a power tool point of view, cutting a dovetail kind of has that allure. It's something that's difficult and impressive, and trying to figure out how to cut a dovetail with power tools is actually kind of a twisted and convoluted thing that you have to have a whole bunch of jigs and you have to have everything set up in order to actually make a dovetail that works. Whereas with hand tools, a dovetail is easier than a finger joint. Because if you think about a finger joint, if you want to cut it with hand tools, you have to cut all those slots, and then you have to chisel them out or scroll saw them out, and then you have to take those pieces and transfer them onto the next board. Well, you're doing the exact same thing you would have done with a dovetail, but with a finger joint there is no mechanical function to it. So why cut a finger joint with hand tools? And with hand tools, the dovetail is just this simple, basic task that we kind of overlook. And so on that point, I want to kind of take a look at the methodology for making a joint. Now, when people get to the dovetail or any particular joint, especially when they've come from a power tool world, you want to then think about how do you set up jigs to make sure that your cut is accurate. How do you set up a rail or a guide? How do you line everything out? How do you make it so that you know it's going to be precise? And this is the first thing I want to tell you about. Get rid of the idea of being precise. Get rid of the idea of accuracy and focus on the skill you're going to learn instead. Because no matter what skill you learn, your first joint is going to be trashy. But it will still work. It will still be a functional dovetail. And you can really make a dovetail a mess, but it'll still work. it'll still go together, it'll still hold, you glue it up, and it will be a joint that will hold for years to come. And once we can get over this idea of it has to be perfect, it has to be flawless, it has to have no gaps, at that point you can start to relax and you can be okay with the learning process. I think that's what scares off a lot of people when they first get into it, is they have this idea of, watching YouTube videos and watching the popular woodworking magazines. You see all these perfect, flawless joints. And I have to tell you, from the media point of view, it is really easy to make a joint look good, because you do 4 of them on a box, and you do 4 boxes in a chest, and you only have to show 1 joint. So you can pick the best one, and it's very easy to hide it. But if you go and actually look at these pieces and look at all the other joints, it's like, oh, well, they're really better than I am. There's gaps here, there's flaws here. You can see places where they've tried to fill it. And I really want to encourage people to be okay with defects, be okay with gaps, be okay with problems, because without those, you're not going to learn. You're not going to improve your skill until you are able to make all these problems. So when you're learning to cut a joint, be okay with it. You're not going to get a perfect cut on your first time. And for those few people who do get a perfect cut on your first time, your second one won't be perfect, I'm sorry. Every now and then it happens, and it's like, ah, yes! So let's actually get into this. Now I have 2 pieces of white oak. These I actually pulled out of a desk that was built in, I think it was 1910, somewhere around then. It was an arts and crafts desk that someone had left in their garage, and half the desk was rotted. It kind of killed me. But the oak I pulled out of it was old growth oak with extremely tight rings on it, and I'm in love with these pieces. But sorry, I had to tell you a little bit of history of the wood, because I love, whenever I make something, I will, I want to create a piece that has history. I want to create something that has a statement to it. We were actually talking about this last night, is if you are getting into high-end furniture, you're not selling furniture. You're selling the story behind it. You're selling the history, the name that made it, where the lumber came from, the different types, and you're selling that story. And so when you really think about high-quality furniture, the story is very valuable. So that's why I like to talk about where the wood came from. That, and I love white oak, so yes. Now, from the power tool point of view, what you've done before this is you've run these through a thickness planer, and these are precisely the same thickness and precisely the same width. And from a hand tool point of view, yes, you can plane things down to be precisely the same thickness and precisely the same width, but there is absolutely no need for it. Because when you're working with hand tools, you're making every joint individually. And so I'll make this one match this one, and I'm not going to make this one match that other one because I'm attaching to this one. So it doesn't matter what thickness they are. It doesn't matter what width they are. You can free yourself up and be okay with having slight variations in things. And going back to the furniture point of view, it becomes very obvious to see a piece of furniture that was made with hand tools and a piece of furniture that was made with power tools, because with hand tools, unless the person is an absolute perfectionist and spent a crazy amount of time on it, you're going to find irregularities, things that aren't quite same here, that aren't quite same there. And they're just small things that you start to notice. And they add a realism to the piece that you just, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's something that you'll notice over time once you start seeing some of the differences. So that's one of the things I like. And that's why I try to make everything as organic as I can. I try and make it with as many little flaws as possible, which isn't that hard to make little flaws. So let's get to the dovetail. Now I have to say I'm sorry, I miscommunicated. I was going to have the camera to feed up here. So I'm going to try and hold things up and show you. And if you want, I'll actually be shooting a video here for some of the smaller pieces. So if you want to see a little bit closer of what I'm doing, I'll try and get that up on YouTube in the next week or so. Get that in. So the first thing you want to do is you want to put a baseline on the board. So how far down do you need to cut your dovetails? And normally what you do is you get a marking gauge, and you'd set your marking gauge to the thickness of the board, and you would run a line on both sides, and then you'd take that same marking gauge over to this board and you run the line on that side. And that's great if you're working with power tools. But with hand tools, I intentionally made these slightly different. There's, what, about a 32nd of a difference between these in thickness. Not enough that you would visually be able to see it. Even if sitting on the bench an inch apart, you wouldn't be able to see the difference. But if you put them together and you feel it, there'd be a slight difference. And if you set up a marking gauge, it wouldn't transfer from one to the other. So the thickness of this board into this board is different from the thickness of this board into this board, if that makes sense. So in order to counter that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this one on the bench, I'm going to put this one up against it, and I'm going to make a line. Flip it over and make a line. And then I'll reverse it, set it on the bench, and make a line. So for those of you in the front row, you actually get to see what's going on. So I can set it up on the bench and draw a line. Flip it over, draw a line. And now I have a depth mark on here that I know is precise to this board and no other board. There is no other board in the world that is as accurate to that line as this particular board. And the nice thing about that is this line that I just drew is 100 times more accurate than any measurement you will ever make with any measuring device out there, because it is taken off of reality. And I think that a lot of people rely too much on measuring devices. They rely too much on inches and centimeters and transferring over that. And part of that is due to the plans culture. And I don't have any problem with plans, or that sounded very derogatory, sorry for that. But a lot of people rely very much on plans and measurements that they've gotten. And you have to be very specific about how thickness, what your measurements are, because the only time measurements matter is when I want to transfer information from one person to another person. Let's do that. So if I want to tell you how thick this is, I can't give you this board for you to then go and make your measurements, go and make your marks off of. So if you wanted to make this dovetail in your shop, I can't give you this board so you can go and make the mark. I can give you a measurement. But that measurement is only as accurate as your measuring device. And so if you want to make something in your shop that matches something in my shop, you can get close, but you're never going to have an absolute piston fit between the two using measurements. And so that's another thing I like to encourage people is try not to rely on measurement. Try and rely on reality whenever possible. Because number one, it's going to be more accurate. And number two, it becomes far more fun. Because you're not wasting your time on things that may or may not be precisely where you want, and you end up getting a little bit better result, which getting a better result is always more fun. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to start with tails. I'm sorry if you're a pins first person, I'm starting with tails. If you ever want to get into a really fun time online, go to some hand-tooled site and say, you should cut dovetails pins first. And you'll have 50% of the people saying, no, you should cut them tails first. And it's a lot of fun to make arguments. I'm going to put this in the vise, and I'm going to cut tails. And this is where the first big change is going to happen, is a lot of people will then get out their dividers and they will lay off precise locations for where they want this tail to be. And then they will get out a guide that is set to 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 or 1 in 5 or whatever you want to make the argument of what your tail angle should be. And they'll put that guide on there and they'll make a very precise line on both sides of it. And I'm going to say no, because it really does not matter what this tail is shaped like. There is no necessity to make this tail like anything. If you want to make this tail shaped like a heart, if you want to make this tail with extremely wide angles, if you want to make it with very, very shallow angles, it doesn't matter. You can make this anything you want it to be. The only thing that matters is that it's wider at the top than it is at the bottom. Because if it's wider at the top, it's not going to pull out. That's the only thing that matters. So why do we worry about the angles? Now, if you really want to get into the clinical methodology and the study of what angle you should use on a dovetail, you can start doing pressure tests and doing really scientific tests to see which angle is going to work better than others. But then you take those same measurements over to reality and you put that drawer in use for 100 years, you're not going to see the slightest bit of difference between, you know, a 1 and 5 and a 1 and 8 on a hardwood drawer. It's going to hold. It's a dovetail. And most of the time, the glue is what's going to fail first, so don't worry about it. So what I like to do is I have that stop line on there. The next thing I want to do is take my dovetail saw, excuse me, the next thing I want to do is take my square, and I'm going to put a line across the top. And I don't care where that line is. I'm not going to worry about making sure it's precise one side or the other. I want to eyeball how far in I cut one side of the tail as the other, so that it looks good, but it's not perfect. And that slight bit of difference is going to give that visual appeal of it's not, it's something that your eye catches but your brain doesn't. It's something that you see as being slightly off. It's something it's more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not realistic, natural, because they're ever so slight imperfections. So I'm going to set this in here, make a line across the top. I'm going to come in about 3/8 of an inch or something like that. And the only reason I'm using a square here is that it is very important that your dovetail, your tail, be square to the face. And it's very important that your pins be square to the end of the board. That way they actually slide together. It's probably one of the only things that really has to be accurate on a dovetail is that it be square. So 3/8 from that side, about 3/8 from this side. Moved a little bit. And then, rather than figuring out what angle do I want to cut it at what way do I want this to be precise? You know, is this going to be an 8 and 1 or is it going to be a 5 and 1? I have no idea. I'm going to take the saw and I'm going to put it on that line. And I don't really care which side of that line yet I'm going to put it on. I'm just going to put it on that line because whatever I make this tail, I can make the pins match. It doesn't matter at all what this tail is as long as I'm running square across. So I'm going to put this on here and I'm going to cut down and I'm going to say I want this saw angle to be there. Not much light on this side. And I'm going to cut down to that baseline. And I'm going to do the...
Can you move that mallet?
Oh, sure. No, I don't want you to see what I'm doing. Don't look at this. So then I'm going to put it on the other one. And I'm just making sure I cut across that line. Sorry, across has a T at the end?
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does. And I'm going to cut this angle at something that feels about the same. And see, where is that line? I'm done, brother. There's less light on my side of the bench. Okay. A little farther. There we go. Perfect. No, there is no such thing as perfect. Perfect is only something that it depends on how accurate your measuring device is. Oh wow. So now we've cut in from either end. And if I look at this, and if you come up to this, it is very obvious that these two angles are very different. And you're looking at it and you know that they're different. But when I put a whole series of these into a drawer, then they're all slightly off. Unless you're looking for it, you're not going to see that. Your brain will catch it because your brain will say there's something that's kind of natural about it. There's something that's... there's something about sawdust in the necks. Your brain will catch it and your brain will say there's something that's not quite right about that. But unless you're looking for it, it's not something that you're going to see. The next thing I want to do is cut off either end. And for this, I then need to continue these lines. So I made that stop cut line across it. I want to take the square up and then wrap that line around so I can cut down. And so what I want to do is put this knife, where is that line? So one problem with knife lines is they become hard to see. A knife, I don't know if you've ever talked about the difference between a marking knife and a pencil. The nice thing about a marking knife is it severs the fibers. So everything on one side of the cut stays and everything on the other side of the cut goes. It is a very, very, very accurate marking device. Whereas with a pencil, you can get a finer and finer point pencil, but there's always going to be lead on top of several fibers. So which side of that one do you want to cut? A marking knife is immensely accurate. The downside is it's hard to see. So let me trace these lines across. So then I can carry that up and put the knife into the marking line, slide the fence up against it, and I have that line across the top that I can cut down. Now, one of the important things is when cutting a dovetail. Yes?
Could you have not achieved the same result with just marking on 4 sides with the first piece of wood?
Could have, yeah. Yeah. There's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. I love skinning cats. Perfect. Yeah, one of the things I love about woodworking is, well, 2 sides. You can do a joint or a cut 1,000 different ways, and there is no right or wrong way. As long as you're doing it safely, you're not going to cut off a finger or endanger someone else. You can do it any way you want. And you will have people out there who say, this is the right way to do it, this is the correct way to do it, this is the best way to do it. No, there is no correct way, there is no best way. Find a way that is enjoyable for you. Find a method that you like to do. And I'll have it all the time on my videos where I will cut something on there and I'll have someone come up to me and they'll write a comment and they'll say, why did you do it that way? Why didn't you do it this way? And a lot of times I'll say, well, I've done it that way in the past and I actually prefer to do it this way. And then sometimes they'll give me an idea. It's like, well, that's an interesting idea. I should try that next time. So yeah, thanks. And I'm going to set it on here. Now when starting a saw, I actually want to pinch the board. And as you pinch the board, your fingers get fatter and that will push the saw blade away. And if you let up on the pinch, it'll pull the saw back. And so you can use the sides of your fingers to be the guide. So I can pinch up on the board and squeeze more and less, and that moves the saw side to side. Now I could do the Paul Sellers thing and cut in a knife wall, but that takes time, and who's got time for a knife wall? Now I'm really hoping that these come out with a lot of defects, because I always love letting people see the imperfections, because if you're watching another YouTube channel, you're going to see this perfect job. They picked the one corner that looks good. And I try to show off the imperfections. I can't always bring myself to do that because some of them are so bad. So I'm hoping that there's some imperfections in here, and I'm trying to be a little loose and free letting that happen, but I don't know. We will see. This may be that perfect time. Now the thing about working with the saw is you're coming into an angle at that point with the dovetail, and there's always going to be some small fibers in the end there. So if you talk to like Frank Klaus and them, they'll have, you can make dovetails right off the saw. You can, but who's going to put that kind of pressure on yourself? I don't know. Okay, there's that side. Oh, wow. I was off the line on that one. Good, well, an imperfection. Let me cut this one out. So after cutting these out, then we can get to the actual art of the dovetail. Because at this point, every cut I've made doesn't matter at all. There is absolutely nothing on this. Hate blowing in a microphone. There's absolutely nothing on this that matters. I can make this any shape, any size, any way I want. This does not matter. The problem comes when I want to then transfer this onto this. Now at this point I have to be accurate, because if this doesn't match this, it's not going to work. So I can't make this anything I want. But this is the only point that matters, is transferring the marks from this piece to this piece. So what I like to do is actually set this in the vise. And I'm going to put this in the vise, and I always bring my block plane. Not that I use the block plane, but it's a nice thickness and it's a very heavy thing, so I set it on its side. And I'll put it in here and I'll slide this down until this is the exact same height in the vise as my block plane. And that way I can move them apart and set the other board on top of it. And that way when this board is on here, I know that this end is supported precisely the same height that this is up, so I have a nice flat surface here, so I can transfer those lines. So, there's a lot of blowing in hand tools. As long as you're not blowing the joint. So put that on there, back this away. Now, this is the important part. This is the point where you want to put a really nice, accurate line on here. And so I'm going to line up one corner, and I'm going to eyeball down the shoulder and make sure that the shoulder is nice and flush with the outside. Put a good deal of pressure on here, and I'm going to put 2 marks on the top. And there, now I have a baseline that I cut down to, and on the top I have 2 marks that I know are precisely designed to this dovetail and no other dovetail. So I know this joint will fit together, or it should. Now here's where a lot of people really mess up, is they stop here and they draw their lines down of where they want to cut. The first thing you want to do before you go anywhere else is put an X on the piece that you want to get rid of. Because I don't know how many times I've cut off the pins and left the tail on the pin board. It doesn't work that way. Yeah, oops, sorry. I actually did that in it was my first ever time. I was at a Rockler and they wanted me to come and cut a couple joints. And I'm talking and I'm cutting away, and as I cut down, I realize I cut off the wrong side. Oops. And so I'm going to put in this. This is one that, how do you transfer marks around a board? So if you have a mark on one side, how do you get that same mark on all 4 sides of the board? You put your square on there, you draw that line, and you rotate it and you draw that line. And a lot of people then mess up by then rotating it one more time and keeping the square on a rotating surface. Because it doesn't matter how accurate you are, this edge will never be perfectly parallel to this edge. Even if you run it through a thickness planer, wood moves, and there's always going to be a slight variation between one edge and the other. And so if you're always rolling the square around with the fence on the opposite side from you, that line is going to have a slowly compounding effect as it goes around. So what you want to do is put the square so that the fence of the square is on one side. That is your reference side. So you always want to reference edge, and then you want to have a reference face. So if your square is on the reference edge, and you draw that side, and then you rotate it to your reference face and you draw it on that side, when you go to the third side, rather than rolling it around, you want to then flip the square around and take it back to your reference edge. And that way on your next one, then you're on your reference face again. And that way the fence of your square is always referencing just off those 2 faces. And so if there is any slight deviation, if there is any slight defect, you'll be adding a degree of an angle and a degree of angle, but on the next one then you're subtracting a degree of angle and subtracting a degree of angle. So your line matches up perfectly all the way around the board. One of those simple things that once you do it a few times, it's like, oh yeah, that's easy. I don't know where that came from, but
roll of duct tape.
Here, let me just clear all this. And that's why I have wooden shoes. So I need to draw lines down. Now, just as on the tail board, I made sure that there was square across the top. On the pins board, I want to make sure that it is square down the face. And so that's one time that I am going to be making a very accurate line down there. Whereas on this, I didn't make any line for what that angle is because I didn't care what the angle is. On this, I have to be careful what the angle is because it has to be nice and square vertically on the pins board. So I'll put this in here. And I'm only going to mark it on my side of the board because when I'm cutting down, this is thin enough that I'm not going to be having too much of an issue with following the other side of the board. If I really want to, I could put a mark on both sides of the board, but it's more time. And if you notice, I'm actually trying to eliminate as many things as possible. I'm not using dividers, I'm not using an angle finder, I'm not using a dovetail guide. I'm trying to make this with as few tools as possible. So I put this in here putting the knife into the knife line, drawing vertically, tightening vise, putting the knife into the knife wall. Let's see if I can see it. There we go. And drawing vertically. There. Now I have two lines that I can follow vertically. Now, most of the time when cutting vertically, if you look at the plate of the saw, when you're cutting into a board at 90 degrees, you can see a reflection of the saw on the other side. So as long as you see that reflection of you see a reflection of the board, if you see that reflection continuing through the saw plate and its reflection being exactly what it is on the other side of the board, you can line up the reflection to give you a perfect 90-degree cut down. Because if your saw leans one way or the other, that reflection then goes up and down in the board. And so you can bring that reflection up to where you want to be. It's kind of hard to explain, but once you see the reflection in your saw plate, it's like, oh, I can do that. And it's one less thing you have to worry about cutting vertically. But in this case, because I'm cutting vertically, but I'm also cutting at an angle, it becomes harder to see that surface being the same as the reflection. Now, I almost made a mistake there. I want to cut on the inside of the line. That's where the X is for. I'll establish the kerf and make sure that kerf is where I want it to be. And then let that kerf guide the rest of the saw on the way down. That way I'm not spending my time worrying about the angle of the saw this way. I'm just worrying about keeping it vertical and following that line I just drew on my face. And let that kerf do the guiding. One of the problems that a lot of people have with handsaw is that they tend to over-control the saw. You want to have a very loose grip. You want to be able to just have this thing kind of floppy in your hand. One of the reasons why people really like Japanese saws as a beginner is that you're cutting on the pull stroke. So the teeth that are first engaging the work are on the opposite side of the board. You have no control over those teeth. I mean, you have some control, but you have very, very little control. So if you want to actually turn a Japanese saw, you've got to put a lot of force into that plate to really twist it in order to get that thing to turn. Whereas with a Western saw, you're cutting on the push stroke, so the teeth that engage it are on your side of the saw. They're on the handle side. So any slight movement in your hand is going to cause that saw to turn. And a lot of people tend to over-control the saw, and they're bouncing all over the place, and they're trying to make this thing follow the line, not realizing that they're telling the saw to veer back and forth, rather than just kind of loosening up and letting the saw do the work. And so if you're having a problem with that, yeah, a Japanese saw might be a great solution to that, because you have to put a lot more force into it to make it do it. With a Japanese saw, if it's tuned up correctly and you set it in the line, you can put a lot of twisting force on that and it's still going to stay true and follow the line. Whereas a Western saw, it will follow the line if it's tuned up correctly, but you have to get out of the way and just let it do the work. So loose elbow, loose wrist, with just enough control for movement. Keeping the arm in line with the saw. Down to the depth mark. I love a saw that can't. Now, another thing that some people will do is they'll put a knife wall into a line that they're following. And a knife wall is you cut your line, and then you take your chisel and you chop out a little V down to that line. Paul Sellers has made that fairly commonplace thing. And that is a great thing. It actually kind of holds the saw up against the line and makes it fairly easy to follow. Another trick you can do is when you cut that line, that knife will create a micro V in the wood. And so if you, on your first stroke, you put the saw at like 45 degrees or so, and you let the very corner of the teeth ride in that line, it'll create its own knife wall on that first pass. And then you just kind of rotate it back up into slot. And that way, you don't have to worry about the knife line. Unless you like a knife line. Everyone has their own thing. So let's do the same thing on this one. Where'd that line go? There it is. on that. Oh, good. I'll be able to clean that up with some chisels. Another thing that when you're working with a saw and your groove starts to turn, what a lot of people do is they try and twist it back into place and they try and veer it back in. But the problem is, in order to get it back in the line, now you're suddenly aiming the other direction. And you're going to start S-curving through your line. Rather than trying to force it back into place, what you need to do is back it up and then use the set on the saw. All the teeth in the saw actually stick out past the saw plate. And what you can do is, if you back it up so that you're past the point where you were starting to turn, and just kind of twist it there and let the side of the teeth rub against the work, and you can bring it back down in and make that line then straight again. Rather than having to try and twist it and S-follow through the line. Make sure I'm good on this side. Yeah, a little far on that side, oh well. So, in this case, on the tail, I was able to cut down with the saw on either side. Now I need to cut out the waste in between the two pins on this one. And some people will want to come in here with a fret saw or a coping saw and cut out that waste. Some people will take it over to the bandsaw and remove the waste. No matter what you're going to end up doing, you're probably going to end up with a chisel coming in and cleaning it out. And so I say, if you're going to already use a chisel, why not use a chisel from the first place? So I like to do all of it with the chisel work. And there's the lace. Oh, you read my mind. So normally I would grab a hold fast and smash this down on here. You don't actually need a hold fast or a way to clamp it down to the bench. It just becomes a little bit easier than trying to chase it around if it's moving all over the place. And this is one of the places where you can actually make dovetails a lot faster. Oops, hadn't turned that camera on. Oh well. I don't know how many times I've done that. I've done an entire thing in my shop and it's like, oh, there's my video for the day, and then I go back to the camera and, oh, I guess we got to do it again. Chisel, mallet. Forgot what I was just about to say. What's that? Gang cutting. Gang cutting. Thank you. If you're doing a drawer, you're going to have at least two sides that go together. Or if you're doing a set of drawers, you might have 4 or 5. You might have 4 or 6 drawers, 4 or 6 sides that you can do at the same time. What you can end up doing is stacking them together and stair stepping them, so that you can do a chopping process and doing them all in order. So you have one clamp that has clamped together this whole series of stair steps, so that you can have all of the ends available to work on. Makes it a little bit faster. Now what I want to do is I want to stay away from that line. So I'm looking at the board here, and I can see that depth of cut line, and I want to actually back the chisel away from it about a 1/16 or so. I don't want to go anywhere near that line yet. I want to save that for the very end. So I'm going to start in the chisel, back it away about 1/16 of an inch, and tap. And I'm going to carry that line across. Made this tail a little bit bigger than I probably should have, but oh well. And then once I have that line in, I can come in and pare in at an angle down to that. And so I'm making a cut down and then paring down to it. And then I'll cut down a little bit farther and I'll pare down to that. And I'm going to do that 3 or 4 times until I'm about halfway through this board. Now, of course, I picked old growth white oak, so this is going to take a little bit longer than, say, pine. Pine, you can do it in 2 or 3 chops. White oak, maple, hickory, no. Now, I've had a lot of people ask me why I use white oak for most of my woodworking. Because if you watch my videos, most everything I do is with white oak. And I think I've made a serious error in that people think white oak is a great hand tool wood. White oak is not a great hand tool wood. It is a very difficult and challenging wood to work with. And that's part of what makes it fun for me. Part of the reason why I use it is harder. I don't find the easiest method to make woodworking. I don't find the method that I know. I find the methods that I don't know. I find the methods that challenge me. Because I find that I have the most fun with woodworking when I'm learning something, and I don't know about you, but that first time when you cut something and it comes together and you step back and you look at it and you think, I never thought I could do that. Those are the moments that make all of woodworking worth it. But you're never going to have those moments unless you challenge yourself, unless you grab things that are difficult, unless you grab things that are unexpected and more than you thought you could do. Like, for instance, a sliding dovetail, or even like recently I did a video on a stopped sliding dovetail. How do you do that with hand tools? Well, you grab a chisel, you grab a saw, and you cut it. You take it step by step and you work through it. And if you take things step by step and you think about, well, what's the next line I need to make? And how do I make that cut on that line? You can break down any joint out there. The most complicated thing suddenly becomes easy because it is a step-by-step process. And if you can then learn to break things down into their simpler steps, then you can do some amazing things and have a serious amount of time with having fun. Okay, I'm well past halfway, but the last thing I'm gonna do on this side is chop it in. So now I have this cut down past halfway, and I have it V-cut out to that. I am away from my marking gauge line, the depth of cut line. Now what I want to do is back that chisel up and put it into that line and pare straight down. Now here's where a lot of people want you to cut a perfectly vertical line at 90 degrees to the face of the board. And if you're a machinist, yes, you want to cut that perfectly 90 degrees line. But for woodworkers out there, don't worry about that. It doesn't matter. Cant it back in a little ways and cut back into the board a little bit. That way you'll get a really nice tight fit line and you don't have to worry about junk getting in there. And in the end, in the life of a project, it's not going to make that much difference to its functionality if you cut back in or if you cut straight down. Yes, in the clinical and scientific testing world, there is going to be a slight difference in functionality and what the stresses can take, but in reality, why put that pressure on yourself? I love machinists, but I hate machinists. Sorry, there's probably machinists in the building. So I started in vertical, just setting the blade in, and I'm going to pull it back at a degree or two and chop down to that depth. And I'm going to do that across. So I'll put it in the marking gauge line. Moved. Start it vertical. Put it back at a degree or two. Cut down to depth. And the nice thing about this is there is no boring part to this because I'm not making any holes. Hey, someone got it. Clean that out. Sorry, now I'm becoming perfectionist. Now, a lot of people really worry about perfection. But I like to think of perfection as a direction, not a location. Perfection is what we will all naturally go towards. If someone doesn't want to improve themselves, there's something wrong with them. Everyone wants to be better. Everyone wants to have that perfection. Everyone wants to shoot towards that point of perfect. But perfection isn't the accomplishment of the task. Perfection is improving towards that task. It's something you'll never get to. And so don't worry about being absolutely perfect. Try and improve yourself, but that will naturally come. Don't make the improving of yourself the goal. Make the completing of the joint your goal, and the imperfection will come with time. That's something that everyone will eventually move towards. Whereas if you're making that your entire goal of moving towards that perfection, you're never going to be happy because you're never going to reach what you're trying to get to. But if you make the joint and the actual thing that you're doing the fun part, you will be learning, you will be having the fun, and you will be improving, because that's the natural tendency of people. The more you do something, the better you're going to get at it. So let's do this side. Same thing, I'm going to back up from the line. Chop down. Any questions while I'm working on this? And it's second verse, same as the first. Keep pairing in. Now, normally I'm going to, in this chat, I'll probably spend, about a half an hour on this one dovetail, and that scares a lot of people off. My first dovetail, which if anyone ever comes to my house, I still have my first hand-cut dovetail. It's on my coffee table in my living room, and I'll gladly point that out. Oh, wow, cut through already. Oh, I was almost like 3/4 of the way through. I forgot what I was saying.
Your first dovetail.
Yeah, if anyone wants to come and see my first dovetail, come to my house. I do not believe in, or I do not personally exercise doing practice joints. I like to force myself to do the joint in reality. Boy, that sounds bad. I'm not in California. I don't do the joints in reality. So I try and make the first time I ever try something that kind of gives me a little bit of pressure, because it's going to be something that is in my house, in my use, and something I look at. But then that also gives me the chance to learn and think about it. So when I see something that I've messed up in the past in my living room, then I can learn to be okay with it and have that aesthetic of, slid past, poorly made stuff. So I'm cutting in at that marking gauge line, and I've got my pins cut. Take that joint off. So here's the moment of truth. I have my pins, I have my tail. These will not fit. I can guarantee it. I'm not Frank Klaus. And in this case, they don't fit. Surprise, surprise. Now, this is a good thing, because number one, I like to try and leave things away from the line a little bit, so that I try and make them a little bit tighter than they need to be, because you can always remove material, you can't always add material on. So if you're going to err one way or the other, err away from the line and leave yourself a little bit to clean up. I like to leave the tails alone and work on the pins. Sometimes I'll work on the tails, but most of the time I like to work on the pins, because I made the tail the way I want it. The tail is what I'm trying to make the pins match. So I'm going to leave the tail alone, and I'm going to try and make the pins match it. So I'm going to put that in the vise, and I'm going to put the tails on here, and I'm just going to look at it. I'm going to rock it back and forth, I'm going to see where is it tight. And in this case, wow, this one's actually really close. In this case, I can see that it's tight down here at the corners. I've made the pins kind of squeeze in there, but it's right about where I want it out here at the end. So I'm going to grab the chisel, and I'm just going to pare back that corner. Now, what happens back inside this pins joint doesn't matter. No one's going to see it. The only thing that matters is the very top edge of here and the front face of here. This corner people will see. Everything inside that people won't see. So if you undercut a little bit and allow it to wiggle down in there, not a problem.
Did you mark one face of the tail, or the pin, excuse me? Did you mark one side or the other to know that, because you made those, your first cuts were different, you said. Mm-hmm. So how did you keep track, or could you see that on the board?
Well, he was asking, how do I know which face is up on which face is up on this board? Because I hand cut these, it's only going to fit one way or the other. And it becomes really obvious when you line those lines up that this one's not going to work. If I were to do this with a jig and these are precisely the same angle, then I'd want to put markings on them to know. Now, if I was doing a whole case of drawers, I would have markings on every board that this is the left side of the second drawer in the bottom case. And I would have all those markings set out there, and that would become obvious, because I always put the markings on the inside of the drawer, labeling what they look like from the front, back, left, right. But in this case, because I'm just doing one I don't know what this will end up being, so. Yeah, but I'll be able to easily look at it. If I flip it over, it's really obvious that is not intended to go that way. And let's see. That's really nice and tight. And that's too tight. Yeah, close to striping that. So as I put it down, I can see that this side over here is angling in a little bit on the pins. So as it goes down in, the bottom of the pins are thinner than the top. And that's really not something you can see until you get the board in place. But that means I need to trim this down a little bit. So what I'll end up doing is, rather than starting all the way at the top of the pin, I'll take this down a little ways into the pin and start into there rather than hitting the very top edge. Because in looking at this right now, when I put this on here, the top edge is great. Down about 1/8 inch or so, this fits exactly where I want. So if this is fitting down in a little ways and then stopping, I don't want to touch anything above where it's fitting. I want to stay below that point. So I want to bring the chisel in lower than that and clean out from there. So, one of the other nice things about old growth oak or old growth anything is it tends to be drier and it tends to kind of flake off. Old air dried wood is so much fun to work with. Let's see what that does. And there we go. Okay. Why is that not going down? Ah, there's why. Okay, so on this one, I'm noticing that on the tail here, when I cut down this way, I stay a little ways away from that line. So this is pushing this out away from the board. So I'm going to clean that up a little bit too. And this is the process that a lot of people don't see when they watch YouTube videos and popular woodworking magazine and such like. You don't see all of this little fiddly jigging that goes into actually making this work. Unless your name is Frank Klaus, this is part of making a dovetail. Or Paul Sellers, or even Paul Sellers. I mean, you watch his videos, he'll go through a lot of this too. This is the detailing work that is needed. This is where most of the time goes. Clean up that shoulder a little bit. So I'm just putting that knife into that line and wiggling it back. And I'm going to undercut it just a little bit inside the joint. Not much, just a curl's thickness. A couple thousand. What are we hitting? Trying to see what I'm hitting, because there's always something that is, there it is. Whenever you're looking for something, what you want to do is take the joint up and move it around and see where do you see light coming through. And right now, I see light coming through in between the tail here, and I can't get this to push all the way down. And when I'm looking in there, I'm seeing that in between the pins, up in here, I have a high point right here in this surface. So I just need to clean that out just a little bit. Thankfully, the high point is on the inside of the drawer. It's not on the outside of the drawer. Because I want the outside of the drawer, I want that line to be nice and straight and crisp. If the inside is off a little bit and there's a little bit of veering, it's on the inside of the drawer. It's harder to find and less noticeable. So I'm just going to pare that out. Put this in here. Yeah, there we go. A nice gappy dovetail. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Now, if I were making this for a showpiece, and I really wanted to do a high quality job, I would probably have taken that much time to make this dovetail, but spent all my time actually making the dovetail. To make this dovetail would probably be about 5-6 minutes of actual work at my bench. But I want to show this to you because I want to encourage you to try and do things in a junky manner. Try and push yourself to make a mistake. Now, I know a lot of people out there thinking, well, I make mistakes all the time. But next time you want to have a little bit of fun, try and do a joint in a way that you haven't done before and try and push yourself to make mistakes. Go faster, go harder, go a different way, go without a jig, and try and make that mess up. You're going to find that you learn something new. You learn a new method, you learn a new technique, you learn a new way of holding something that you haven't learned before. And as long as you're okay with those imperfections and you know they're going to be coming, it's okay, it's fine. So here, I'll pass this around. You guys can take a closer look at a junky dovetail, because I'm sure no one here has seen a junky dovetail. But when you really want to learn something, when you want to expand your borders and try something a little different, try and do something where you're going to mess up. And be okay with that. Push yourself to do something a little different. And so that's why I have this over here. This is a spring pole lathe. I'm going to move it back so I'm not hitting anyone. And I know you all know what a lathe is. I hope you all know what a lathe is. I shouldn't assume that, because there's always a first. So if you don't know what a lathe is, don't look at this thing. A lathe turns the pieces of wood so that you can make a centrifugal carving on it. Now, most people today think about a lathe that moves continuously in one direction. And that is the easiest way, it's the most efficient. But the first forms of lathe were what are called a spring pole lathe, or a reciprocating lathe. And what this does is every time I step on the paddle, this arm comes down with a string. This string, oops, I got to back up a little more. The string wraps around the work, and it runs off the end because I moved the pedal. The string wraps around the work and rotates the work. But the problem is I go down, it's got to come back up. And so now I'm going to have half my rotation cutting and half the rotation not cutting. And this is really inefficient. This is a hard way to cut. This is difficult, but this is really fun. Because it's something that kind of stresses yourself. It's something that pushes you out of your comfort zone. And so when I got into, I used to do turning before, and I went down that rabbit hole. And if anyone's ever turned before, there's a full rabbit hole that goes into it, and you buy all the jigs, and you buy the chucks, and you buy the pin turning kits, and all those types of things. And it's a lot of fun until you've turned one of everything, and then it starts to dive off. Unless you're a turner, and then it never dies off. This is kind of a whole new movement to turning, because you get to do all these things that you did before. You get to do the pin turning and the bowl turning and the spindle turning and all those fun things, but it's a whole new job, because every time you cut, it's new. And so it's just too much fun. Sorry, I gotta stop. Every time you cut, it's going to go forward and then come back. So you have a couple different ways of doing it. Number one, you can ride the bevel, and the whole thing is kind of bouncing on you, which is what I was basically doing there. So on the reverse cut, it's rubbing up the bevel. Or you can get really skilled at it, and with some of the quality turners out there, you're going to see, especially the people who've been doing it for years, they can actually bounce off. So as it goes down, they engage the blade and cut, and then as it comes up, they pull it back. So 3 or 4 times a second, they're moving the bit in and out with this going up and down, and they're all doing it while standing on one leg and bouncing. That's a lot of work, but holy cow, this is a ton of fun. And I got into doing this because, well, when I originally was going into hand tool, I thought, I'm going to make a flywheel lathe because I want to do lathe turning, and that's the most efficient way to do it. But this is a toy that is incredibly fun and incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging. But once you actually get something on it and you get a chance to play with it, it becomes incredibly rewarding. And so this is kind of the next jump off that I went into with hand tools, of trying to find a method or a tool that is different, that is more challenging, that is less efficient, but more fun because I'm spending more time actually learning. So if any of you want to afterwards, come on up and play on this. I brought it here to let you experiment and play with. It's a ton of fun. And this particular thing is really easy to make. If I wanted to, I could probably make it in a day in my shop. And there are all sorts of plans on the internet for it. And so this is the type of thing that you can make quickly. If you don't have a lathe and you want to experiment with it, learning to turn on this is not like learning to turn on any other lathe. So the skills don't automatically transfer, but if you learn on this thing and then you jump on a regular lathe, it's like, wow, this is a lot easier. But this is light enough that you can pick it up and you can carry it around. You can break it down and put it in your car and take all over the place. So this is one of those things that I like to encourage people. If you're a turner and you're trying to stress yourself, you're trying to try new things, try a spring pull lathe. If you know turning, it's a lot of it is going to be the same thing. A lot of it, how you use the tools, how you hold them, what is the angle of the tool, and all those little things that you have to learn over time in order to get a really nice clean cut. You'll know those things already, but then you get this whole banjo playing, pat your head and rub your belly type thing that is, it's a lot of fun, but anyone can learn it. Anyone out there can learn this. Anyone out there can cut a dovetail. Anyone out there can make anything you want to make. When people ask me, what is the first thing I should make as a beginning woodworker, I would say, make a Queen Anne's highboy. That would be an awesome first project, because when you're done with that project, you can do anything. As long as you take it step by step and you take every individual thing, I can guarantee you it won't be the best Queen Anne highboy that's ever been made. But I can guarantee you when it's done, you'll look at it and go, that's a highboy. That's a really nice highboy. And all you have to do is take it individually, step by step, be willing to make a mistake, be willing to stress yourself, be willing to try something new, and you will be amazed at what you can accomplish. Those things that you think that are way out there and as a skill you're never going to learn, those are the skills that you will surprise yourself on. Carving. Carving is that thing that everyone thinks, oh, I could never do carving. Carving is like this artistic skill that takes everything and is something that it's incredibly hard to learn. I taught my 7-year-old to carve. And if you start getting something simple like a V-tool chisel and tracing a line and doing some Celtic weave carving, which I have now been doing on all of my tools. Where's my other mount? Oh, here it is. Now this one I had a carving on the side, and this was like 5 minutes of work on one side and 5 minutes of work on the other, just with a V-tool following a line. And if you can follow a line with a pencil on a piece of paper, you can do that carving. It's not difficult at all. And then you want to take this a step further. You can start inlaying the voids in between the lines, and you can take a bench chisel and carve out some of the space in between them. And then from that point, then you can start doing some undercuts. And from that point, you're already doing leaves. And carving is just another method of doing step by step, taking it in one chunk at a time, being willing to mess up, being willing to take that chance, and anyone can pick that up. It is incredibly easy. I mean, if you don't believe me, go watch Mary May on her website. She has beginner videos that anyone can pick up, and in 5 minutes you can be carving. It's not that difficult a task. So that's kind of where I want to leave it today. Be willing to challenge yourself. Be willing to take that step. And that thing that you think is impossible, it's not. Anyone can do it, and everyone has learned it at one point or another who's done that. If you talk to someone who's made a high-end highboy Queen Anne's chest, they started someplace. And anyone can do that. It is not something that is only held to people who have that skill. It's not something that's only held to people who we think have that artistic quality and character. Anyone can do it. So that's what I have today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jake. Very, very good.